In 2017, Iowa Republicans passed sweeping changes to public employee labor law. The result has been a dramatic shift in the lives of the roughly 100,000 public employees here in Iowa. And while most public sector workers are all too familiar with how detrimental these changes have been for their labor unions, conveying the impact of these laws to a broader public, perhaps those in our communities who work in the private sector, and especially in non-union jobs, has posed a challenge. My name is John Tappen. I'm a PhD student in the Department of American Studies at the University of Iowa. This summer, I had the good fortune of being a Humanities for the Public Good intern through the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies. As part of my internship at the Iowa Labor Center, I assisted my supervisor, John McCurley, in producing an audio documentary podcast that seeks to explain these radical amendments to labor law and the recent attacks against public sector workers. It does this by tracing the history of the public sector union movement here in Iowa, by foregrounding the stories of Iowa teachers in the 1970s, whose activism was instrumental in bettering the working conditions of not just themselves, but all public sector workers. Labor law is, almost by design, inscrutable, and so instead of parsing out the particulars of the laws that govern workers and their employers, the podcast makes use of the recorded interviews held within the Iowa Labor History Oral Project Archive, or ILHOP. The story of a school worker strike in the small industrial town of Keokuk, Iowa in 1970, the first Iowa teacher strike in decades and still the most recent, and their struggle for a fair contract is the primary focus of the piece. In the voices of those teachers, we hear why they went on strike, what they were fighting for, and what they hoped to gain.
Everyone was beginning to feel the frazzle, and the tension was growing deeper and deeper. And finally, it just came to a point where the negotiating team said, let's have a vote among our association members and see how they feel about should we take it to the next step, which of course was an illegal strike, which meant you had to think a long time, because illegally means that you may not have a job tomorrow. You've got a family to feed, and you've got a mortgage to pay, and you've got a car payment to make. You sort of needed to have a little income coming in to be able to meet your bills. But the preponderance of the association said, we want to accept this challenge. We have a tough choice that we have to make, and life is full of tough choices. And this may mean I'm not going to have a job. But will it mean it's going to be better for the future of education? We have to take that risk. And we did.
Just a few years later, in 1974, the state would pass a law that allowed for collective bargaining between public employers and labor unions. This law permitted local, county, and state employees, including public school teachers, custodians, maintenance workers, social workers, nurses, teaching assistants, and road crews, among others, to negotiate with their bosses for better pay, benefits, and workplace protections. However, the law was also a compromise and included harsh penalties for public sector workers who went on strike. And indeed, since then, public sector unions have seldom gone on strike here in Iowa. Beginning with the teacher strike in Keokuk, the podcast considers how the rise of the public sector union movement changed Iowa's social, political, and economic landscape, and what happened when Republicans gutted many of those gains in 2017. For my part, I listened to, transcribed, and annotated roughly 30 hours of interviews and archival tape with teachers and organizers, legislators and lobbyists, and others involved in the fight to establish collective bargaining laws here in Iowa. I honed skills in primary source analysis by reading through newspaper stories, conducted secondary research on the history of teacher unionism in the U.S. In parallel with this work, I was also introduced to the technical skills of audio recording and editing. I learned audio editing software, preamps, best practices for using various studio and field microphones and mixing boards, and I grew to understand the essential details of how to best set up a room for optimal sound. These new skills foregrounded the medium in which we were working and accentuated the affordances of sound in composing a narrative and conveying a message. In my conversations with my site supervisor, we spent a lot of time thinking about audience and how we might translate what is otherwise an academic argument about the importance of this legal history to a broader public. We did so by asking what is sonically compelling, and how might we juxtapose the voices of various characters within the Ilhop archive to establish conflict? How can we use the music and other audio tools at our disposal to develop a scene or to ground a story in a particular place? It's been these experiences that have compelled me to think just as rigorously about audience and form as I had about argument and content.